Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so very much for joining us today for our candid conversations on transformative policing. This is actually part 2, systemic racism and the history of policing. My name is Erroll Southers. I am a professor of the practice of national and homeland security at the Saul Price School of Public Policy. And with that, I would just have you know that today's actual panel is a collaboration between the Saul Price School of Public Policy here at USC, the Executive Masters in Leadership program in the school, the Hispanic American Police Command Officers Association, and the Safe Communities Institute, where I am the director. Again, I want to thank you. I have had the honor and privilege, if you will, of being in law enforcement. Some 41 years ago, I had the honor of saying I do, hoping I could be part of that change. And today we're going to be talking about some of the things that need to change. But I would like to open by saying thank you for your service to all of those out there who are in law enforcement, who are in public service in some way, because I do appreciate it. I want to just say to you today that, the public death of George Floyd in May of this past year is an undeniable inflection point in the historical arc of the relationship between law enforcement and the citizens they've sworn to both protect and serve. But I do think that arguably never in the history of this country has there been a more opportune time for law enforcement communities that consist predominantly of racial and ethnic minority residents to resolve to improve these essential relationships to achieve safe communication and interaction that necessitate transparency and accountability. I watched George Floyd's memorial, and nothing was more telling to me and more poignant than the words of Sheriff Hubert Peterkin from North Carolina when he said that law enforcement needs to say the 6 words: we are part of the problem. And so today we're going to have a very candid conversation about systemic racism and about the history of policing. You have an outstanding panel. I have the honor, if you will, of introducing the moderator for today's panel, the director of the Executive Masters in Leadership program at the Saul Price School of Public Policy, my esteemed colleague, Professor Carol Geffner. Carol, it's all yours.
Thank you, Errol. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And welcome to everyone. We have a full house, although in this remote environment, we can't see all of the faces from around the country. Errol is my esteemed colleague. I'm Carol Geffner, and I am also a professor of practice of governance and management here at the Saul Price School. Today's conversation is extremely important from my point of view. I have the good fortune to have many first responders and law enforcement officers in the Executive Master of Leadership program. So I'd like to, without further ado, introduce the panel. I'm honored to be here with such an esteemed panel. I'd like to introduce first the Los Angeles District Attorney, Mr. George Gascón. Welcome, George.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I'd like to introduce Mr. Skipp Townsend, the Executive Director of Second Call. Welcome, Skipp. It's great to have you here.
It's great to be here. Thank you, Carol.
And last but not least, my esteemed colleague also, the Chief of the Department of Public Safety here at USC, Chief John Thomas, otherwise known as JT. So welcome, Chief, and let's get going. I would like to dive right into the questions so as not to waste any time. The first question is not only one that I think a lot about, but this question is raised to me on many occasions. JT, why don't you start off with a few perspectives? And the question is, what is the difference between systemic racism and individual racism? And if an individual says, I'm not a racist, and in fact is not a racist, why should that individual be concerned about systemic racism?
First of all, thanks. It's an honor to be here. But when you look at institutional racism, you have to look at where it began. You have to go back, at least for this country, to 1619, because I think you have to deal with an issue the issue of race in America really got its birth when the first slaves arrived here in 1619. And then you have to look at those institutions, the institutions that impact people of color disproportionately. Those systems and institutions that, based upon the notion that certain people are less than or inferior, that those systems were denied equality. And I'm talking about the very critical ones that impact the quality of life, those systems that impact education, criminal justice, healthcare, jobs. So when you look at the institutions, those are the institutions that deny the equality for members of certain races and groups. But I think you have to look at it from the perspective of where it began. And to the second part of the question regarding individual, can an individual racism and the impact of individual racism, I think you cannot look at them disconnectedly, because in order for that individual to possess those, they have to buy into that institutional notion of racism that denies or believes in one group of people being superior and one group of people being inferior. And those are the ones I think that we most come in contact with as individuals and as people in our individual lives. And it could be something as simple as an individual that just doesn't believe in interracial marriage, or doesn't want, a Black or brown person living on their block. So I think that's the distinction, but I don't see them as mutually inseparable, because one could not exist without the other.
Thank you. That's a great introduction. Skipp, would you like to pile on that and share a few perspectives?
Yes, well, I think what JT just said was so important about one can't separate the other. But I don't want to go back to 1619. If we could just go back to 1963 when I was born, and racism was alive. And if we talk about institutional racism, everyone in my family lived off Central Avenue, and we were supportive of each other. But as 1968 and 1972, the Fair Housing Act, we started moving around. But the institutional racism was already there, because what we want to do is be a part of a system that did not want us to be a part of it. So we stopped going to the mom and pop grocery stores. We stopped going to support the Black businesses on Central. And now we want to be a part of IHOP and Sears and going to the better stores and the better communities. And we stopped caring for ourselves. So I think that is one of the ways that systemic racism has really affected the community, is because we stopped caring about each other and we cared about what other people thought. And I grew up in that era where we started having offense against each other and taking offense against each other. So I think that is one of the greatest forms of systemic racism, where we perpetrate it amongst ourselves now.
Thank you very much, Skipp, for adding to the comments. And George, I don't want to put you on the spot. Is there anything you would like to add to what has already been said?
Oh, I mean, Carol, I think that both JT and Skipp cover very well. I think the reality is that you cannot separate systems from people, right? People create systems. Systems do not create themselves, right? So if you believe that you're not a racist, but you feed into a systemic racist system, then you are part of the problem.
Yeah, I think that is a very crucial point, because all of us interact with people, some of whom have questions and or challenges with the notion that the classic statement is, I'm not a racist, I don't perpetuate racism. So I think this is just way overblown. And I think all of you have spoken to the fact that we cannot separate ourselves from the systems of which we are a part. I'd like to build on the history that JT started talking about, and that is, how is the history of law enforcement informed where we are today? And again, JT, you opened the door to that, but let's look a little more deeply at that. Skipp, let me throw it over to you.
All right, I'm sorry. Say the question one more time. I heard JT and I got my pen. I was going to write notes.
No worries. We're all doing the same thing. What can we learn from the history of policing, and how does that history inform where we find ourselves today?
Right. I think that's an excellent question, because the history of policing or overseeing actually came, like JT said, from when the slave era was over, or during that time. But when it was over, the Jim Crow laws wanted to make sure that certain people stayed in certain areas, make sure they were working. So the law enforcement was actually created to make sure that Black people stayed in a certain area and made sure they were working. I think it's hard to pass on generational ways of thinking and think that the newer generation will change the way they think without the help. So I think that when we start looking at policing today and where it came from, we have to start rehumanizing the communities that we work in. I believe that the community has to start rehumanizing who the police officers are. We have to change the perspective of police officers who come from one community and go into another community to work. You know, it's sort of like putting on football pads and a helmet. Let's go kick some butt and go out there. And how do you do that in a community where there are people who actually live in these communities? So it shouldn't be that aggressive behavior, sort of like the competition in football or basketball or something like that. But it definitely stems from the days of slavery and right after slavery, when Jim Crow laws went into effect. And I keep pushing 1963, because if we look at this in history, and I'm sure a couple of you guys are older than me, but if we look at it in history, all the redlining, all the different things, the Fair Housing Act, even Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy, all of them were killed after this. So imagine that this way of thinking is not as old as 1619. It's as old as 1968.
Yes, and all of us of a certain age have been familiar with the trends and the past abuses about which you speak. JT, I know that you spend a lot of your time studying, or have spent a lot of your time studying, the history of policing. Would you please add on to this part of the conversation?
Yeah, and Skipp is right. Yeah, you have to look at it in where it's come from, because that impacts how Black and brown people view the police, particularly from the Black perspective. Policing began as a result of vigilantes that were empowered to capture runaway slaves. And they had the power and authority to violate any law that was on the books, including going into someone's house that could be harboring a slave. And then that evolved into the Black codes. And that was also designed to limit and disenfranchise Black people from voting and from living certain places. And these were codes that came out after Reconstruction. So you had the slave patrols, then you had the Black codes. The Black codes then evolved into Jim Crow. Jim Crow was the laws that basically defined, desegregation. So when you look at that, these were actually laws that bred from the fact that one people could hold and enslave another group of people. And then laws evolved to ensure that even after they were free, that they were still subjugated into an inferior place in society. And it continued. And it continues, and Skipp, I'm from that same generation, and we grew up in South LA. It evolved into a pattern and practice and a mindset of how Black people see the police from generation. It didn't stop with slavery. He's talking about in 1963. I was born in 61. Most of my life, I still had this embedded in my mind, and it was as a result of the entity that was responsible for ensuring that the Black codes, slave patrols, Jim Crow, all of those things that were designed to ensure that Black people, quote unquote, knew their place in American society, were enforced by law enforcement. So we have to own that, and I've been in this profession 36 years. We have to own that legacy, and we have to train to it. Officers should be hired based upon awareness of these sensitivities and these cultural sensitivities, not just with Black people, but Latinx people and other disenfranchised people. So when you start to think about one group of people holding another group of people enslaved, and the very entity responsible for perpetuating that unequal status quo was law enforcement. So we have to own that, and we have to move from that. And that begins with how we recruit, how we train, and how we hold officers accountable.
That's it. Both of you have provided a really good snapshot. I mean, I wish we had more time so we could delve into the history. We all know that looking back is essential to look forward, and learning the lessons, both positively and negatively. And as you say, as you suggest, JT, people who are hired into the system today, oftentimes, most often than not, have no connection to that history, but that history, as you both have articulated, informs what's happening today in many ways.
Well, can I add this?
Please, please.
And I'll ask the DA because he was a part of LAPD. We put a 21-year-old person who has never had any interaction with Black or Latinx people in a community like South LA or Hollenbeck, and they have no understanding of why those communities feel the way they do about the police. I was never trained that. Unfortunately, I didn't have to be because I grew up in South LA, but that should be a part of an officer's education to work in specific communities to understand what are the dynamics. And that's something that can be taught to officers of all races. It's just not done.
Absolutely. And George, I'd like to actually shift gears a little bit because I want to make sure we have enough time to cover a number of questions. So I'm going to move to the present. Since day one of your job as Los Angeles District Attorney, you've been given a number of directives, and these directives have been referred to as the largest single effort to overhaul or transform a local criminal justice system or law enforcement system. Can you share with all who are listening today a snapshot of what some of those directives are and what is the thinking process that went into them?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that, both JT and Skipp set the ground rule here really eloquently, talking about history. So following up on this, I've come to the conclusion, and by the way, as JT indicated, I started with the LAPD, so I've evolved, and I come to the conclusion that the system actually is functioning exactly the way it was designed to function, right? So reforming the system is somewhat inadequate because the system is actually perhaps doesn't need any reformation. The system was created very early on, back in the days of slavery, to do what it did, and it just simply continued to do it extremely well. And we got into the 80s and 90s, and we sort of, became more mechanized about what we were doing. But, we incarcerated Black and brown people at disproportionate numbers without any care for the consequences, not only in that community, but other communities as well. So based on that belief that the system actually needs to be reimagined, it has to be restructured, myself, with the help of many others, we came up with a set of initiatives that were very clearly laid out during the election period. So, I never said that I would do anything other than what I'm doing. And from day one, we put a series of directives precisely designed to basically deconstruct and start the system looking at a very different way. So, we talked about putting an end to the death penalty. And why? Because the death penalty doesn't work. It doesn't work socially, economically, or it doesn't provide certainly any improvement to our community safety. But what we do know that it does is very racist on its application, right? Especially in LA County, but throughout the nation. We talked about no longer prosecuting kids as adults. Why? Because we know that actually kids do not react to the same pressures that adults do. You know, our brain is not fully developed until we're somewhere in the mid-20s. And again, we saw a system that basically took Black and brown kids, treated them as adults, incarcerated them very early on, and created a breakdown, a social breakdown, as well as an economic breakdown. Took money away from education and mental health and other services and put it into a system that continued to perpetuate itself. We talked about the fact that enhancements do not provide any additional safety to our community, but they can take a base sentence and they can multiply it 3, 4, and 5 times without any connection to safety for our community, but clearly, again, with tremendously racist consequences. So basically, those and many other things that we looked at during the campaign, I put into place immediately as soon as I got elected. And quite frankly, as it was anticipated, you know, the people that are still embedded in the past are fighting really hard. And it's really driven by multiple things. Number one, I think, is really driven by underlying racism, even though people will say no. I think is driven by economic interest, because you have both in law enforcement and you have private industry that have built up an entire mechanisms around mass incarceration and what it entails. I think it's also based on political power, right? We know that law enforcement, especially police unions and, you know, prosecutors unions, have for years exerted a disproportionate amount of political influence in our legislative and our political system, to the point that anybody that would come up and speak against them was automatically labeled as soft on crime and therefore not qualified to do the job, and they would not get elected or they will be unelected. And we basically wanted to break away from that mold and really start heading in a different direction. And now we have the fights that we're anticipating.
So let me piggyback on that. You've taken on a Herculean set of tasks, and I'd like at another time to be able to talk to you about what the change process that's underway. You've spent much of your career leading large law enforcement organizations. Some people, as you well know, would see some of these transformations as being antithetical to an approach that speaks to, you know, a tough-minded law enforcement approach. Can you share with us what has happened over time with you and to you that has resulted in the shift that you have made?
Yeah, and you know, JT and I grew up in the LAPD about the same time, so I know that he's going to be very connected with what many of the things that I'm going to say. But for me, look, I tell people, I readily admit that I was part of the system, right? And I came in the system really kind of in an unusual way. You know, I grew up in a very poor part of the county, Southeast LA. You know, our neighborhood was generally not treated very well by the LA County Sheriff when I grew up. But I went in the Army, came out of the Army, went to college and got into policing. And immediately, you know, quite frankly, I embraced the culture, if you will. But what became very obvious to me as I matured and grew up in the organization was that so much that we were doing really wasn't providing any more safety. To the contrary, I think it was creating more insecurity. It was certainly enhancing the racism that is embedded into the system, and that we were socially and economically destroying our community. And that process for me began to become more and more clear in the last 15 years. And by the time that I became a chief of police and I went to Arizona, I left the LAPD, I was very clearly moving in another direction. You know, then I became the chief of police of San Francisco, and again, that evolution continued. And then I was a district attorney for nearly 9 years in San Francisco before I came back home. And that evolution for me was really based on my own personal assessment, my own personal education, but looking at the things that we had been doing and how ineffective they were in terms of providing community safety, but how effective they were in continuing to enhance the systemic racism that has been on for generations, the impact that it has socially and economically in our communities, and coming to the conclusion that we needed to move in a very different direction. And I thought that I certainly would be part of that process. And by the way, I like the way you say it's an Herculean effort, but I want to make it very clear. It's a community effort, right? This is not George Gascón fighting the world. This is a community that's come together and say, we had enough. Over 2 million people in the county voted for me. I get a great deal of support. This is really a community movement to take us to a different place.
Let me stay with this question for a few moments. And I think that's a perfect segue. And I'd like to ask actually both JT and Skipp. Skipp, let me go to you first. What do you see and hear in the community? What do you feel in the community that speaks to what George is saying? That is, that this is a community effort. Are you beginning to experience or see any of that bubbling up? Are there disconnected kind of trends or pressures that are happening in the community? So let's just take what George was talking about in terms of this is a community effort, and see what it listen to what it feels like and what you are experiencing in your work.
Definitely, it's a community effort. First of all, let me thank George Gascón, because he actually said exactly what he was going to do when he was running for office. And that I find difficult to find people who stick to their word. So I appreciate that. But all the community and all the jailhouse lawyers have come out, and they are helping to get individuals who have done 20 and 25 years for crimes where they were sentenced to 6 years, but they have a 15-year enhancement. Everyone's trying to help get their loved ones home. Like there are some very minor crimes. And I just like to pinpoint that people who are afraid of other people have been coming out against the district attorney. And it's because they're afraid of people. So you imagine if someone's done 25 years in prison, there's a fear of that individual coming home, not knowing where their mentality, where their mindset is. So there are people in the community, there are people incarcerated who have sent me lists. They've given me a list of people, which I've given to someone who works at the district attorney's office. But these are cases they're already working on. These are the fight that they're already having. And there are just so many people waiting to reconnect with their families that the community has truly embraced the district attorney, because there's hope now. When there was hopelessness for so long, there was always the fear that they don't care about us. And not actually until I met Dana Garcetti did I ever have any love for Gil Garcetti. When I met his daughter, it's like, oh, okay, well, you guys are nice people. But now when the DA, George Gascón, comes around and he has actually done what he said he's going to do, trust and believe, he can walk into any community right now and he'll be loved.
That's a stunning statement, and I hope you hear that, George, and keep that with you as other experiences come your way.
Loud and clear, it's in my heart, and thank you.
Yeah. JT, is there anything you would like to add to this in terms of your experience?
I would, and I would just say, it's not just the community's responsibility or the DA's responsibility. Unless these other institutions, because we're talking about institutional racism, unless these other institutions are dealt with and actually reformed as well, it's still not addressing the conditions in these communities, because at the end, we're still talking about a broken healthcare system, a broken educational system. We still haven't dealt with the community trauma, which is the root of a lot of the criminality that goes on. So, the district attorney can only do so much. There has to be other support systems in place, because again, if you start, releasing these individuals and they're coming into the community, they got to have jobs. Somebody's got to have a place for them to live. So unless we address those issues, bottom line is we're not gonna solve the issue of crime and disorder with just his proposals and what he's planning to do if we don't have anything in place right now. Because if we put them in, if they're getting incarcerated, and in that incarceration they're supposed to be rehabilitated, and that doesn't happen, and they come back out into the community, guess what they're going to do? So I think you can't just look at one part of the criminal justice process and say that alone is the solution, because there's too much trauma in Black and brown communities to say that, that's just one piece. And then the other piece is looking at the officers. By and large, the majority of officers want to do a great job, but they're frustrated because nobody's looking at the reality from their perspective. And that is, they're looking at the same crimes often, the same criminals. And I don't care how much community policing you put in place, unless you begin to address the trauma in those communities and the issue with Black and brown boys, by the time they're in the third grade, if they can't read, that their life trajectory is probably leaning toward crime anyway. Those are some systemic issues that have to be dealt with outside of the criminal justice process. Sometimes I think we want to take the short and easy route and say that it's all about law enforcement and the criminal justice process. That's easy. That's very easy to say that that's the problem, because that's the part that touches Black and brown men most. But what about when they come out of incarceration? What about before they go into incarceration? Those issues have to be dealt with. Otherwise, all of the DA's plans and visions for what can be will not be, because there needs to be more investment into the community trauma.
And Carol, if I can add, I completely agree with JT. The only thing that I would say is actually LA County is moving in that direction, right? We're not just simply talking about releasing people, and Skipp knows this. There are many organizations that are actually beginning to work to facilitate reentry. Measure J was a perfect example of community coming together and saying, we're going to start putting funding into those services. I can tell you that we're working with the Amity Foundation, and we're working with a bunch of community groups. The people that are coming up will be coming up with a warm handoff, and they will be going into places where they're going to be embraced and they're going to be given the support that they need. Also, in the prospective part of this, which is ensuring that we do not criminalize kids early on, so that they do not end up in prison. And that definitely is the role of law enforcement. And that's why, for instance, I support not having police presence in our schools. Why? Because in Black and brown schools, little Johnny gets into a fight and the handcuffs come up and they go in the back of a police car, right? In another community, Johnny gets into a fight and he gets taken to the principal and say, don't do it again, Johnny, right? So the process is very different, and we need to start thinking about approaches outside of a law enforcement solution for other social problems. Totally agree that we need to invest in education, public health, and social services. But I can assure you that at least what we're trying to do in the district attorney's office today is not being done in a vacuum. We are working with the community to ensure that the people that are coming up are going to get the services that they deserve. Now, is the world perfect? Do we have all the mechanisms in place? Clearly we don't, but we're moving in that direction much more quickly than I think a lot of people know. There is the County Board of Supervisors had the vision of creating the Alternatives to Incarceration Office. We have Judge Armstead, who has been given a great deal of resources to begin this work. We have our Office of Diversion and Reentry. Again, there is movement in that direction, and I think it's important for our community to understand. We're not simply going to give people a $100 voucher and a bus ticket and a Greyhound ticket to come back to the community. We're actually working to have a warm handoff and people coming in here to a setting that will assist them, hopefully becoming more likely to embrace him and make him successful.
So far, what you both George and JT, what you've spoken to is the fact that there's an ecosystem. So it's larger than any one organization, right? There's an institutional connection. And, I think one of the questions that comes up in the minds of some is, how long does this take? I mean, I will tell you that I've spent my career working with large scale organizations driving change. And I know personally how long it takes to try to change or transform one large organization. So I'd like all of your perspectives. What is it going to take to get us to a place where we can, where where the public can say, we're seeing changes? What's the reality? Who would like to start that?
I'll take a stab at it. Clearly, it's taken us hundreds of years to get here, so we're not going to turn this thing around in 1 or 2 years. But I think that there is a lot that can be done in the next decade. And I think that you're seeing the beginning of the process. I think, in order for an organization, as you well know, Carol, to sort of have a cultural evolution, it takes, 6, 8 years, sometimes longer. But, some of the early steps are very important in setting up the framework for that. And, sometimes you're going to move fast, sometimes you're going to plateau. There's going to be a little reversal that you move forward. I think the key to this is having a clear commitment to change, having the collective leadership. And I say this because this is not about one person, by the way. Again, this is about entire communities coming together, understanding the direction that we're going to go, understanding that we're going to have to sometimes, stop, take a breather. We may have to go around an obstacle. We may have to go over some things, but just a commitment to moving forward. And that has to start from a basis, I believe, of believing that what we have today has not worked, right? That is critical because we still have members of our community, quite frankly, the more affluent communities, the white communities say, well, what's wrong? Policing is okay. And, policing is maybe okay in their neighborhood, right? But policing is not okay in the Black and brown neighborhoods, right? Policing is okay in their schools, but policing is not okay on a Black school, right? So we have to get everybody to understand that, what we're doing is not working, and this system needs to evolve into a different place, because you can only change things if you come to the belief and the understanding that where you are is not a good place, right? And that's what we're hoping to do. And frankly, I think that last year, the murder of George Floyd was a parting of the waters for white America, right? There was nothing there that Black America hasn't seen before, or brown America, but white America for the first time saw what racism and what bad policing could do. They saw a murder, a cold-blooded murder occurred in a period of several minutes in front of the cameras. And I think that was an awakening, and we have to make sure that the gateway that was open as a result of this tragedy is not wasted.
Yes, and I'm going to stay with that, George, for a moment. Skipp, can you talk a little bit about the effect that the George Floyd murder has had in the community? And then JT, I'd like you to address that as well.
Well, I just want to say that for years, individuals, even including myself, have often talked about the things that happen in our community. We're often taught by law enforcement and city officials to let it go. Even in the LA County Jail, there's some horrible things that have happened. So it wasn't new to us. And if I can go back to 1991, it wasn't new to us then when it happened to Latasha Harlins, when it happened to Rodney King. We had been saying in our communities that this is how we're treated. But for the most part, because the access wasn't there, with the cell phones. So now it's there and everything is captured. Even the body-worn cameras capture so much, discrepancies that we have. There was a LAPD deputy chief who actually showed me where his officers were fired upon, but it happened so fast, no one saw it. And, he was showing me that, Skipp, this goes back and forth, that both communities, the law enforcement and the community has it. The only difference is it has been easy to believe law enforcement for years. And now it's starting to where people are starting to believe the Black community. The only problem I have is that there are still a number of people who say that, well, you didn't see what happened prior to the video. You didn't see what he did at first. And they still want to justify. They still want to say, well, you must have done something. And those are the things that really, it hurts my soul. And this is something that I can say that is cultural bias, that it actually hurts my soul. So when there are people who don't come from my community who feel offended by it or feel like, wow, this is horrible, I don't know that they can feel it in their soul. that when this happens to someone, this is happening to me. There's vicarious trauma. We're in a toxic relationship, and it's not post-traumatic stress disorder. It's constantly reoccurring. It's present stress. It's present. The trauma is present. So I just want to share that part.
Before I go to JT, I just want to ask you a follow-on question, which is, there are people from the community in law enforcement who make that claim, who say, but you didn't see what happened before. How do you respond to that? How can one respond to that?
I know plenty of people. JT is one of them. A few other officers who come from the community, who actually went to, the local high schools and played at the local parks or whatever. I think what happens is and I got to give a shout out to Kenny Gardner, because he said it best when he said that he's the father of a dysfunctional family. He is LAPD, but he's also community. So merging the two and making the two as one, we're not going to see eye to eye. There's so much culture in LAPD that sometimes law enforcement will see it in a law enforcement way and forget about the culture that they come from. And if they represent the culture that they come from in law enforcement, how will they be looked? What will the perception of other officers look at them when they start speaking up and speaking against the things that are happening? So I think it's a very difficult balance that they have to have, but it has to be a healthy balance. It cannot be unhealthy on either side. So I think it's a hard task.
Thank you for that. And JT, if you want to make some comments about this, let's hear from you. And then in about 2 minutes, I'm going to address some of the questions that have come in from the public.
It's and I echo what both George and Skipp said. But when I look at what happened with George Floyd, I look at it from the perspective of first and foremost as a Black man. And then I look at, how many times have I seen that happen to someone that wasn't Black or brown? And Skipp is right. It's just being captured on camera. But when you think about George Floyd, here is the radio call that the officers got. It was basically suspicion of passing a counterfeit $20 bill. That was the call. That's what brought the officers there, and it cost him his life. So when you look at law enforcement through that type of lens, and I've not talked to an officer that in any way justified that. I've never worked with anybody who would actually think that was justification, but we all feel the brunt of that just by virtue of being in the profession. But when you look at that alone, isn't that question enough to say there needs to be reform? Something is wrong when this happens repeatedly, time after time, and and it's always something minor. It appears to be something minor that causes that. And to me, it's just indicative of you've got to address more than just the law enforcement part of that. That's the perfect place to start. Law enforcement and the criminal justice process. But I do go back to my point before. There has to be more systems approach to deal with it, because when you look at the trauma in the communities and when you look at the opportunities, it becomes very easy to point the finger of blame at law enforcement, because we're the most visible representatives of this government. And we also are the ones that, if you're Black or brown, we're also the ones that have the duality of our circumstances. Growing up in South LA, my biggest concern was the sheriffs and the police department. And if you're from families, like mine, you have individuals that are in your family that got caught up in gangs. You become very aware of the disparities when those contacts with the police. As George mentioned, you go to school and you can wind up in handcuffs by virtue of an incident that's looked at totally different in another type of school. So the pitfalls of becoming caught up in criminality are very real. The traumas are very real, and I don't want to get away from that point, at least from my perspective, that the easy shortcut is just, let's look at law enforcement. Let's look at what are the actions of police officers when it's a very difficult and complex job that we have to balance from the perspective of you've got to wear so many different hats that you weren't trained to wear. I think the best thing that I had going for me was my background in South LA, that I knew, what it felt like to be profiled. I knew what it felt like to, just traversing from, UCLA, where I was a student, to South LA, that was a dangerous commute, because I had to go through some very expensive communities, Beverly Hills and, West LA and places like that. And my issues were always, being stopped because I fit the description of. So unless you look at it in its totality, why did that happen? And why does it continue to happen? And what are we going to eventually do about, every aspect that caused the environment for those things to occur? We're still scratching the surface, because I think the burden on law enforcement is so great that unless we get this right this time, I'm not quite sure where we go from here.
So I'm going to take a question that has come in from participants from the audience and follow on that. You have all eloquently established that there is an ecosystem, and what that means is that there are so many organizations that are part of the problem, and that the community plays a role also in healing and facing the problems. So I'd like all of your perspectives, and this is coming from an audience member. What can be done in the short run that is actionable? How can we make progress while there is a long-term transformation process underway? Who would like to start with that?
Look, I'll take a quick stab. I think that the first thing that we got to do is stop doing the things that are harmful, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff that we know that they harm us, that they do not create any more security. And I think that we need to do those, right? You're never going to have a perfect world, right? If we try to have the perfect set of circumstances in order to move the criminal justice system or the educational system or the health care system, it will never happen, right? We will be paralyzed by analysis. So I think that there are concrete things that we can do. Do not criminalize poverty, right? Stop arresting people because they are poor, because they're mentally ill. Start having a different level of intervention. I agree with JT. There are some things that the police should never be asked to do, and we need to move away from that. Do not treat kids as if they were adults. They are not, right? We can stop doing those things right now. When the police does right, let's reward them. But when the police commits a crime on the community, let's make sure that they are held accountable. We can do that right now. We don't have to have a perfect system. So I believe that we need to start doing the things that we can do with the tools that we have today and continue to build the infrastructure to get to a better place every day.
Excellent. And any other comments about this?
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick. And I just want to say that when we start rehumanizing each other, the victims and the suspect come from our communities. So let's just take little Johnny, the same little kid that the DA said is getting into a fight at school. Well, if I work with this child for 3 or 4 hours, right, and I work with him after school, go through programs or whatever, and it's sort of like taking a bath. I'm going to get him to change his behavior, his attitude, the way he thinks, the way he sees life. But if I take him home to the environment that doesn't support the change, if the change isn't being supported at home, then it's like taking a bath and putting on the same dirty clothes. And when he gets up to go to school the next day, and law enforcement and the principal at the school looks at him the same as well, well, we're not even changing our perspective. We're not changing the way we look at the people we're working with. So we have to change not just the child and the people in the community, but how do we help change the environment, and how do we help change the way that we look at individuals? And I think the perception is so important, because as JT stated back in 1619, there was no value for a person of color. But now can we look at individuals as if there is a value? That's the important thing.
Thank you.
I think we have to own our legacy in this profession. We have to own up to the history of law enforcement, and then we have to restructure how officers are recruited, trained, and held accountable. George mentioned that we get exactly what we want. We have the type of departments that are exactly designed to do what they've always been intended to do. So I think the paradigm has to shift away from what do we want on the back end? What do we want in our communities? And then back to the serious investment into those resources, into those communities that have never been done. Because again, unless you address Johnny's home situation as to how he shows up at school, that's an important part of his success. And what is his community dynamics like? What is the trauma in that community? And I know it's not an easy task, but I think we've taken the shortcut in so many ways when we look at this problem by just pointing the finger at one institution and saying it's all the police. Well, as long as we continue to do that, we're going to have the same results. And at some point, the value of a Black life and a brown life has to be equate into, we've got to fix this. It's not going to fix itself, because the only thing that we have right now, when I look at what our criminal justice system does and who it houses in its majority, they look like me and Skipp. When you go to any correctional institution in this country, there's the majority are Black men. When you go to Skid Row, downtown Los Angeles, which is a deplorable, sad situation, they're Black men. So at some point, we got to get to a place where, we're not operating from these anti-Black biases that structure how these institutions operate. So my thoughts are that unless there's more focus on other entities other than just that one, we're I don't want to be overly pessimistic, but I think we're bound to fail, because at some point we got to fix it. And we haven't even become comfortable with even talking about race in this country. That's the 10,000 pound elephant in the room. Everybody wants to get past that. Well, there's no fixing this as long as we're not going to address that. And it has to be done in a way where people don't feel blamed. They don't feel as though they're responsible, because, in the end, none of us were here in 1619. But the reality is we have an obligation to fix it. And there's a whole lot of people that benefit as a result of not being Black or brown, and the privileges that go along. So yes, you have to look at it from its totality, but we got to stop taking the short route and the easy route, or the comfortable route. We got to get past this hurdle, which is race first, in my opinion.
So we have about 3 more minutes for this discussion. And I'm going to take a question that came in from Facebook that actually relates to some of what you're talking about now, and to an earlier comment about the importance of conducting cultural training, which also includes training and discussion about race. And that is foundational in all parts of the ecosystem and in the community. So the question is, what do we do to implement this? The prelude was, JT, you mentioned cultural training earlier on, and the person who sent in this question is saying, so what do we do? How do we make this happen? Who would like to give that a stab?
Well, I want to start, and I think it's great we have Chief Thomas on, because it could start with the officers, but it also has to start in the community. One of the things we do at Second Call, we deal with reentry, where individuals are coming home, and we have to change the way they look at it, the way they look at life, period, because they've come from an institution and know that a prison is an institution where there's a lot of hatred in there as well. There's a lot of fighting between the different races. So we have to break all that down when the individuals come home. But I think with law enforcement, I think with LAPD and the LA County Sheriff, I think they have to rehumanize the communities that they work in. I think JT alluded to it earlier. A 21-year-old who come from Simi Valley or Diamond Bar has no clue what to expect in Hollenbeck, has no clue what to expect in Southeast. So we have to do that cultural awareness training. These individuals, these officers, and these community members have to get uncomfortable. We have to say words and paint pictures that they understand that this hurts. So if it hurts you vicariously and you didn't go through it, it's okay. But we have to have these open dialogues. If not, we're not healing. The community's not healing. Law enforcement's not healing. It's a toxic relationship, and it's bound to explode.
Thank you. Thank you. So let me take one more question. Actually, I think I'm getting the sign that I can't take any more questions because it's 1:58. So I first of all want to thank all of those who've tuned in today, because this series and this event as part of the series was designed to have conversation about some issues with which we are all involved. We are all part of this. And so I want to thank all of you who are listening. And I also want to thank Skipp Townsend, District Attorney George Gascón, and Chief John Thomas for taking your time to be here today. And, you know, it is my hope at a personal level that these conversations, albeit brief, open up some dialogue that will continue in the homes and the workplaces of some of those who are listening. And at this moment, I just want to say thank you. And we are logging and documenting all of the questions that are coming in from each event. And we are hoping to follow up on many of them because we can't get to them during these brief discussions. So for all of you who are sending in questions, we are not ignoring the questions, and we're hoping to do something where we can continue talking about them. So thank you to everybody, and have a healthy day. Stay healthy and well and safe. And we'll see you in April for our next event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Be well.
Thank you.